So you've been living your whole life here almost, except the years that you've been in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And you probably watched the degradation of the environment over the years, how it went
Yes.
from one point, like from point A to B to B to C. So I want to know, like, your observations over the year. What has changed dramatically? The first question.
I mean, there are normal changes that you expect, but then there's the abnormal changes. Like this town, the village of Beit Sahur, was much more green when I was growing up. And those hills there used to have a lot of birds and frogs and other things. Even after the rains, the frogs would come on the street, and migrating birds would be behind this house. So things have changed. That hill across the valley there is Jabal Abu Ghanem. Used to be forested, now it's an Israeli Jewish only settlement in which Palestinians are not allowed. Even the Palestinians who own land there, like my relatives, the land was taken over and now is beyond the reach of Palestinians. It's beyond the wall. If you want, they built this apartheid wall. I could go on forever describing the changes that happened, but they're all negative changes in terms of the environment. Palestinians before 1948 were mostly subsistence farmers, and now 70% were subsistence farmers. Now less than 3% are subsistence farmers. Most Palestinians are refugees now, or displaced people, and the remaining Palestinians, like we in Bethlehem, live in these cantons, which we are isolated, and there's a permit system which then allow you to travel to, so basically you live in these islands which are isolated even from each other. Archipelago of islands, and most of the land is taken over by the Israeli state.
Do you think the NGOs or like the organizations that they claim to be sustainable, or we're doing a conservation of sustainability and environment, do you think they do their jobs in Palestine?
Who can?
NGOs and organizations.
NGOs? Well, there's obviously, since Palestine was occupied, its government taken over by the occupiers, colonizers, the Palestinians had no government, so they did establish civil society organizations. They're not NGOs in the traditional sense. This is before 1993, because many of them were not licensed by the Israeli state. And those civil society organizations tried to replace what would be the normal function of government, like healthcare, schooling, other things. And that's how it operated for decades. And then Oslo Accords, of course, meant there is now a Palestinian Authority with limited authority, really no authority, but at least they were certifying civil society organizations and making them like NGOs. And some of them had to do with agriculture, some with healthcare, some with education, etc. Palestinian Authority actually tried to replace their functions. Regulating them was used as a mechanism to disband them basically and control them. And so any NGO that was not part of the ruling party apparatus was not treated fairly or whatever. So in terms of sustainability, I don't know what you mean, but there is no sustainability under occupation, under colonization.
No, because some organizations, they claim that they're doing that job. That's what I meant. Like, we're preserving the environment, and these development organizations, especially like sustainable development organizations, even in
But there are very
West
few
Bank.
like that. There are very few that claim that they are able to increase sustainability of people. But there are some that help farmers, for example, and they do a good job in the limited abilities they have to try and help some farmers. There are some that helped healthcare, and they did a good job, and they were limited in their function by the Israeli occupiers. And but again, they scratch the surface of a deeper problem, which is colonization. Colonization and sustainable development are incompatible. In fact, colonization is about de-development. It works to de-develop the Palestinian economy, de-develop healthcare, de-develop education, de-develop everything, because the colonizers want the land without the people. So everything they can do to pressure the people is part of their job.
Could you talk about a little bit of environmental racism in West Bank concerning the policies and implementations by the occupation army to Israeli government? And if there is collaboration between PA and Israeli government in terms of that?
Environmental injustice is part of the injustice of colonization. It's the same as health injustice, education injustice, religious freedom injustice, all these things. So environmental injustice is also understandable in the context of colonization. So the oppressors, for example, they will use the natural resources for the benefit of the colonizers, the occupiers, and deprive the natives of their resources, of their natural resources, of their water, of their woods, of their natural gas, of their even simple access to the sea, for example, in Gaza, and to fish. This is part of their milieu, is to deny the people their rightful access to natural resources, benefit sharing. This is not on the agenda of the occupiers. So environmental injustice means that you destroy everything that keeps the people alive here and keeps the Palestinian nature alive, and you divert it towards the benefit of the colonizers, if benefit can be done for them. So in the case of water, for example, Israel diverted the water of the Jordan Valley from Lake Tiberias to the west. Israel drained the wetlands of the Hula and kicked the natives out of there, but this also impacts the animals and plants there. Israel also, destroyed much of the trees that were around the Palestinian villages that they depopulated. They depopulated these villages, meaning they kicked the people out. And when they kicked the people out, they also demolished the trees that the people planted. And in place of that, they planted European pine trees, which are a monoculture. You see, that's the whole concept of colonialism, is to replace a poly-something system to make it a mono-something system. So polycultural, multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, even multilingual society, as happened in the US, for example, when the Europeans came. There was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural society, even multilingual. There were so many tribes speaking different languages. They wiped all of that out, and they become this English-speaking country. This is the nature of colonialism, and the same here. But also in terms of plants, to make it more uniform, you remove the different kinds of trees that were there, the hawthorn, the carob, and the oak trees, etc., and you replace them with pine trees. Make the country look more European, Northern European actually, not even Southern European. And this again is expected and natural from colonizers. So all of these are considered under the rubric, if you want, or the heading of environmental injustice, or what I prefer to call the environmental nakba, catastrophe of the environment that came with the nakba of colonization.
Some of the, like for example, some of the interviews I had with the farmers, they all talked about the lack of support and lack of compensation from PA to the farmers.
The PA also, I didn't speak to that. Palestinian Authority, you have to remember, was created in 1993-94 as a result of the secret agreements made in Oslo and beyond in Washington when they negotiated under the support of the US and the Israeli government. And the whole purpose of this process, called the Oslo process, was to create a quisling government that does the job of the occupier, so that the occupier doesn't have to spend money and have administrative functions or structures or anything else. So it was a brilliant move because it created something worse than the Vichy government in France at the time of the Nazi occupation. Because at the time of the Nazi occupation, the Vichy government was supported by the Nazis and derived its income from the local people. This Vichy government, called the Palestinian Authority, actually does not get any financial support from the Israelis. Actually, the Israelis milk it, and it gets all its income from abroad, from stealing humanitarian aid that comes for the Palestinians. And the government ends up spending, it used to be 43% on security. Now it's about 36% on security. So roughly a third of its income is going to security for who? Not for the native Palestinians, but for the occupiers, to protect the occupiers from the potential resistance of Palestinians. That's its function. But the budget comes from abroad, from begging and pleading European countries or other countries to give the authority financial support. But despite all of that, the support has been not sufficient to keep up with its demands, and especially because of the corruption and all of this stuff. So you basically ended up with the Palestinian Authority being like a parasite on the people, and being basically an impediment to liberation because it's helping the occupiers. Now, this applies to all spheres of life. I don't want to make it sound all bad. I mean, the Palestinian Authority also provides healthcare and education and other things for the Palestinians. And some of this has been very good and very needed services. But still, the overall function has been corrupted by the Oslo unfair agreements, which were actually an Israeli design that from the beginning it was actually formulated in 1968, and they tried to implement it many times between 1968 and 1993, and they failed at each time. But with the PLO under leadership Mahmoud Abbas and Yasser Arafat succumbing basically and selling out, they were able to achieve what they have always aimed for, which is a subservient Palestinian Authority that keeps the Palestinians out of the Israeli political system. So you don't have democracy here, and you have a minority rule, which is Jewish Zionist rule. And the native Palestinians are given very, very limited authority to do certain things, pick up garbage, deal with a few things, but mostly policing their own people. That's the whole concept, and it has metastasized into two authorities, not one authority, one in the West Bank and one in Gaza. And so it has been very negative since 2006, basically, and split into two authorities. So it really has not helped the Palestinian cause. And if you take the parts of that that's related to agriculture and environmental issues, again, you can see that it has not been very helpful. Ministry of Agriculture employs hundreds of people, but they don't do very much to support the farmers, as you heard from them. They support the cadre of office clerks and people in offices that are not really doing a whole lot towards agriculture or helping the farmers. And the evidence of that is very clear from the numbers. I mean, you can look at agricultural production, or the percentage of people employed in agriculture, or the number even of people employed in agriculture. Everything is on the decline, not on the increase. And I would say if you have a ministry whose self-stated goal is to promote agriculture, then you should see an effect for it after nearly 30 years. The effect should be positive. If it's not positive, then something is wrong. So obviously something is wrong, because the effect is not positive and the environment continues to deteriorate. Again, I don't want to, make it look like that's the major problem, because the decline is not due to an intentional policy of the government, Palestinian Authority, to decline agriculture. It's an intentional policy of the Israeli government to decline agriculture in the Palestinian areas and make them dependent and enslaved laborers in Israeli settlements and Israeli industries, indentured labor, etc. This is a well-articulated policy at the highest level of the Israeli government. So the ultimate responsibility is the Israeli responsibility. The Palestinians, if they are responsible for anything, it's for dereliction of their duty to resist and to mobilize against that and all of that.
Does it, since you're a scientist and then now you're doing this project and hoping to probably expand the institute, and does the occupation itself affect your work?
I mean, let me be very clear about what we are trying to do, because that's important, and it's obviously an evolving concept. But the most important thing we are trying to do is to keep the hope alive, and especially focusing on children, to give children environmental awareness and education, agricultural awareness and education, so they can see what's going on and they can reconnect to the land. And that in itself keeps the population, hopefully, again, you can ask me later to how much I think we have succeeded, but this hopefully will be like seeds that you planted. Each child is a seed. Hopefully it will grow, it will fruit, it will give ideas, it will give concepts to other people, and then they will resist and they will grow their own food and they will have food sovereignty as in time when they but first they have to liberate their minds from mental colonization, which is more dangerous than the physical colonization that we face. Mental colonization means defeatism. Mental liberation means empowerment. So you want to empower people, you want to liberate the minds first. And so what we do is empowerment. We empower people through education, school students, university students, even adults. As they come and see a museum and see a botanical garden, they feel empowered and they can think of possibilities, etc. And then this is one mechanism, this education and awareness. Others through research. You have to, knowledge is power, as they say, so you do research that helps local people.
But how does it affect your work? That's also what I want to know. Maybe it's affecting you mentally, physically.
What is?
The existence of occupation, and then you living under it, and you're also trying to create hope under the occupation, and how does it affect you?
How does colonization affect? The colonization affects every aspect of Palestinian life. Sometimes I joke that the only thing they don't control is, soon they may try to control it, is our breathing, our ability to breathe. And they may tax us on that at some point. But everything else I control. The water we drink, the food we import, everything is controlled by Israel. The movement, the education, the healthcare, the entry and exit of friends and relatives and supporters who want to come and help us. Everything is controlled in a negative way by the Israeli occupation to try and make our lives hell. So this applies to all Palestinians, and certainly we are Palestinians, and we are a Palestinian institute. That's why it's called Palestine Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability. So obviously it's impacted by the same things.
But how does it affect you personally? That's what I want to know. What does it cross your mind every day when you wake up and go to the institute and you work like you really work? You're super committed and one of the most, I think, hardworking people that I ever met. That's why I feel like sometimes you're like my dad, because he is like that when it comes to what he does.
Yeah.
Super committed, super hardworking, works all the time. And you are like that, so, but I want to know, like, how this colonization of your land and your people, how does it affect you? On personal level.
At the physical level, it's the same as every other Palestinian. For example, I'm not allowed to enter Jerusalem. I'm not allowed to go to certain areas I want to study or research. Like the protected areas that are most significant are off limits to us. The inability to export things like material specimens, even books are held, even certificates that were sent to Muhammad Najjar and us from China. They wanted 500 shekels to release, and these are just some certificates.
Paper?
Paper.
No, maybe.
So he told them to send it back. We had donated used books that were never arrived here. We had several volunteers like you guys who were denied entry when they discovered they're coming to the West Bank. So they were denying, I think 7 or 8 volunteers so far were denied entry. So that's at the physical level. If you're asking about the psychological level, of course, when I wake up and look across the valley here to see this colony that's taken my family's land and that's growing like a cancer, and that they destroyed our habitats and they continue to destroy our habitats. And I think of all these things that they do to us, to not just to me, of course, to millions of Palestinians, refugees, the murder and the killing that's going on now. Over 110,000 Palestinians probably have been killed. And every day or two there's another Palestinian or two who's killed or a home demolished or anything. Of course, that you know, you can see in Ukraine, it's been 10 days or 11 days of Russian occupation, and there are many people who cannot handle it, and they're going into mental institutions. So imagine this going on for 7.5 decades, you know. 75 years, 74 years we've been living under these conditions of displacement, dispossession, murder, killing, genocide, illegal imprisonment of people without trial or charge, torture of people, shooting people on sight, children being detained, homes being demolished, displacing more and more people as time goes by. And the world is silent. Of course, that has a psychological impact on everybody, not just me. Now, how do people cope? Some people cope by going to alcohol or drugs or killing themselves or violence or whatever. And some people do other things. Everybody does different things. And we do what we do, which is what you heard me say about what we do and how we do it and why we do it. So that to me is a form of resistance, but it's also a form of retaining our sanity, our humanity. If we take care of nature, take care of animals and plants, it tells us that the world could be a better place. You know, one time I was reading some stories about slaves in America, for example, and there was a story that touched me about this one slave who was behind the slave quarters. At night she was planting things and growing things, and master discovered it, and of course punished her, but the fact that she has done it for years without being discovered, so to speak, was, you know, for her, that was to keep her sanity, being a slave. So, to me, this is essentially what we are doing. We are keeping our sanity despite the insanity of the situation.
Do they harass you because what you're doing and you're so active?
Of course, you know, that's understandable. I mean, I was detained, arrested a few times, maybe 10, 11 times, I don't know. And, you know, Jesse has been here for 13, 14 years. They haven't given us the family reunification. There are people who are collaborators who get it like within a day or two, even or a week or month. So, so they punish us in different ways. That's fine. That's expected.
Could you talk about the importance of Nakab?
Importance of what?
Nakab desert. The Nakab?
The Nakab.
And the displacement of Bedouins and why it's so important, why geographically important for people who don't know.
Well, when the Zionists started coming here, they started settling mostly along the coastal areas. And some around Jerusalem, a little bit, West Jerusalem primarily. coming from Europe. I'm talking about the late 19th century, early 20th century. By the 1940s, there was about 25-30% of the population here was Jewish. Most of it, 97% of it, was immigrants, European Jews. Very few native Palestinian Jews, indigenous Jews. And those were actually against Zionism. But the Zionist settlements, communities, colonies, if you want, were concentrated, as I said, along the east, along the coastal lines and around Jerusalem. So in 1947, the Zionists pushed the US and became in control basically of the US foreign policy, which the US president at the time, Truman, he decided to push the UN to recognize that there's a Jewish nationality, so to speak, not just Jewish as a religion. And so he wanted to create a Jewish state. So he pushed, they couldn't get agreement in the UN Security Council, which is where these decisions are usually made. So they went to the General Assembly. General Assembly of the UN, which was only 2 years old at the time, 1947, had 45 or 50 countries or something like that. And they tried to pass this resolution to partition Palestine, which never heard of at the UN or before it, what was called the League of Nations between 1917 and 1945. Because there is something called self-determination, which is that the people have the right to determine their future. And the majority, vast majority of people here did not want their country partitioned. So, so they rejected that, of course. But the US pushed it through as a recommendation of a General Assembly. A recommendation had specific implementation process for it. This was not followed, of course. The Zionists just simply took this recommendation as a green light to ethnically cleanse the areas that were put on the map as quote-unquote Jewish areas. The resolution also said, basically dividing the country into 50-50 or 52%, 48%. 52% for the Zionists and 48% for the Palestinians. But the resolution also said that in the areas that would become the Jewish state, this 52%, that the Palestinians should remain and they shouldn't be ethnically cleansed, which would mean that the Jewish state is actually 50% Palestinians. So it would not have worked for the Zionists to have a state in which 50% of the population is not Jewish. So they proceeded immediately after this resolution was adopted to ethnically cleanse first the areas that were on the map appearing as Jewish or Jewish state areas. And that's what started the conflict, basically, is the ethnic cleansing of 1947 that started there. The Galilee and the Negev were not included in the so-called Jewish state by the UN map. They were supposed to be part of the Palestinian state. And because of this delay, the Zionists were ethnically cleansing the areas that were allocated to them, and they were going to go to the next stage. And they had plans for this, and it was all documented. They had plans for complete ethnic cleansing. And Ben Gurion said, we should accept, part of Palestine, but we want the whole thing eventually, and we will take the whole thing eventually. With or without, this is his words, with or without the agreements of the Arabs, as he called it, the Arab countries. Okay, so they, when it came to ethnic cleansing the Galilee and the Negev, by that time the Arab armies were involved and the Palestinians started fighting more, and so there was partial ethnic cleansing of the Negev and the Galilee. Approximately half the population was removed, whereas other areas 100% of the Palestinians were removed. So those remaining Palestinians in the Galilee and the Negev became known as Arab Israelis, because when the ceasefire was declared and adopted in Rhodes in 1949, they were already within the control of the State of Israel without being removed from their villages and towns. So there remain some villages and towns. This was a bad kind of problem for the Zionists, because they didn't get their pure Jewish state that they wanted, which the world didn't want. You know, the UN General Assembly, even though it was a recommendation, was very specific about that. You cannot have a Jewish state. You can have a state, but you have to allow the natives to remain who are there. So that's why the Negev and the Galilee were a hanging problem for the Zionists. And the population in those areas grew rapidly after 1948-49, from about 150,000 to now about 1.5 million, tenfold more. People reproduce. So in that case, what does the Zionists want to do? And every Zionist have said, we have a problem. We have a demographic problem. The Galilee and the Negev are not Jewish, and we need to make them Jewish. How are we going to do it? They try expulsions. It worked on some people, sometimes it didn't work. The world stood against it because they said there's no war now, you cannot claim. But anyway, the refugees who left during war have a right to return to their homes and lands according to international law and according to UN resolutions, including UN Security Council resolution, not just General Assembly resolution. So Israel was in the dilemma of how to deal with this quote-unquote problem in their view. So what they did is they developed plans to consolidate the people. And for example, there's the Brouwer Plan, now called Brouwer Plan for the Negev, which was, before that was called the Plan to create concentration areas for the Bedouin of the Negev. And then somebody pointed out to them that this public relations issue, if you say concentration areas, people think concentration camps, like what happened in Germany, Eastern Europe, so you have to be careful. So they changed the name of it, but it's still the same. Its idea is to take 35, 40 communities of Bedouins in the Negev and consolidate them to 3 or 4 communities. Put them basically in open-air prisons. That's the idea of the Negev. And take over their land, basically. Make it Jewish land. This is the idea for the Negev. And of course, the people of the Negev have been resisting this since 1948-49.
And a majority of those people are Bedouins, which are traditionally important to Palestine.
Yeah. I mean, Bedouins, you have to understand what Bedouin mean in Palestinian structure and civil organizations. Bedouins in Palestine are not nomads.
Yeah.
They're not like nomads in Africa who keep moving, you know. Bedouins are just people who live off of basically animal husbandry, goats, sheep, cows sometimes. They have their own communities. They are different than the farmers, for example. They have their own communities, and they traded with the farmers. And the Negev had a high concentration of Bedouins, but so is the Galilee also, by the way. There are Bedouins in the Galilee. Bedouins in Palestine. Again, it's not like a desert people or anything. Galilee, of course, is not. And the Negev, northern Negev, where most of them live, is not a desert. It's slightly arid, but it does get 300-400 millimeters of rain every year, and that's enough to grow crops and to raise sheep and things like that. So that's who they are. Some of them were ethnically cleansed in 1948, the gehalten Bedouins. They came to the Jordan Valley. They lived in the Jordan Valley from 1948 till 1967. And then Israel occupied this area, the West Bank, in 1967, and kicked them out of the Jordan Valley into the upper hills here near Jerusalem. And now they want to kick them out a third time and move them, like the Khan Ahmar Jahalin Bedouins. They want to move them near Al-Azariya to a waste dump site. This is the nature of colonization, the nature of the beast, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, also, I want to ask, how can we educate people about the fact that this land is colonized? Not the only problem is the occupation, because widely focused on, even from the Israeli activists, it's focused on the aspect of occupation only. So are we just looking at 67? And why are we just looking at 67? So when that's the case, usually, like, a lot of people are also offended, obviously. But how can we change this focus on, like, from only occupation, but to the bigger concept of colonization, which started in 48 and the seeds were planted way before.
I mean, military occupation is one aspect, one symptom, if you want, of the underlying etiology, which is colonization. The diagnosis here is colonization. It's not military occupation. Wars are also symptoms of this. Making refugees symptoms of this. It is not none of these other symptoms are the cause. It's like saying if I have cancer, I will have many symptoms like skin rash, headaches, anemia. These are symptoms. They're important. They point out to the diagnosis, but you have to make sure you make the right diagnosis. Diagnosis here is settler colonialism. That's a problem. That's the underlying cause. It's different for other countries. For example, when Germany occupied France in 1940s, that was military occupation. It was not settler colonialism. The Germans did not bring large groups of Germans and made the French all refugees. You know, there is a different, and it has its own. I mean, the military occupation of France had its own symptoms, but they are different than, let's say, the symptoms of settler colonialism. It's very clear that settler colonialism has unique features. You have to understand it, and fortunately also there is a whole literature on settler colonialism. We understand it very well, whether it's in the US or Australia, South America, Central America, South Africa, with the Dutch and the British colonization, or much of the colonization of Africa, Kenya, Rhodesia, what was called Rhodesia after a colonizer by the name of Rhodes, and so on and so forth. This has a set of characteristics that are very well understood.
But when it comes to Palestine, it's not understood by West.
Well, I mean, it's starting to be understood, and I give you a very, and I think the awareness usually originates in the West by the excesses of colonization activities. But of course we have a problem that the Zionists were, unlike other colonizers, they were very well aware of the power of the media and how to use the media, and they ended up infiltrating most Western medias and even buying them outright, like the New York Times or whatever. Now they bought, Rupert Murdoch bought German TVs and stations and things like that. So the message gets confused and conflated and intentionally misrepresenting the facts and presenting falsehoods as facts. And presenting Israel as this weak country that's defending itself against terrorists who are intent on killing it for no obvious reason. I mean, all colonizers try to present that, but early colonizers didn't have access to massive media. Israel came as a late colonizer, and so they were able to use the mass media to much more effective ability than other countries before it that were colonizers. So, if you think about the Western, for example, idea about Native Americans, even till the 1950s, natives were presented as barbaric, violent savages, and that the whites were simply circling the wagons, protecting themselves from these terror-inducing people who are screaming and yelling at them for no obvious reason and shooting at them and killing women and children and things like that. That was the message they gave to their own people. This is what had happened. But Israel had the benefit of using this message on a much wider scale and hiding the truth of what's going on here. Truth of the situation, and they were fairly successful at it for a while. But as I said, sometimes the excesses of what they do gets them in trouble. For example, when 1987 uprising started, October 1987, and then in January 1981, the then Defense Minister Rabin said to his soldiers, go break the bones of these demonstrators. And they literally took it to heart, and they went catching demonstrators and putting them on, breaking their arms and their bones like that. In one instance near Nablus and Hawara, the Israeli soldiers had a demonstration against them in the village of Hawara. In the middle of the village, the soldiers were there, but they couldn't catch anybody. So they came that evening, and they rounded up all the people that they could round up, put them in the square, and then soldiers picked 12 young people between the ages of 13 to 23. And people say it was random picking, It's like soldiers saying, maybe I saw this guy, maybe not, but doesn't matter. It was to give them a lesson. They took them to a nearby valley, and the commander asked his soldiers to break all the 4 long bones on each one of them, the arms and the leg, of course. And they started with their sticks. But after a while, the sticks broke. Human bones can be very strong. So they started using stones. They would put the guy down, hold him for people, and break with the stones, break the... then as an act of kindness, supposedly, the commander said to the soldiers to leave one person with just broken arms but not broken legs, and then have this guy go back to the village to get help after the soldiers left, because they didn't want them to die, he said. This is his kindness, okay? This story was told in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz because one of the soldiers basically said, this is what happened, that he himself did not participate, refused to participate. The commander told him, well, if you don't want to participate, stand on the side. But anyway, the soldiers were never punished as usual. They never punished these kinds of things. There's lots of videos of soldiers using stones to break the Palestinian bones, things like that. But these stories of excess, you know, the Western media, despite being Zionists, they couldn't ignore some of it. So they started showing it, and videos spoke for themselves, you know. That was 88, and from 1988 on, people have started to understand the power of these images and these views. So they started mobilizing to use 3D cameras and things like that.
Well, what do you think about the soldiers now? Like, some of the soldiers are coming out, exposing the crimes and what kind of things that they have to do in the name of,
you can
their
go
commanders.
to the website of Breaking the Silence.
Yeah. That's what I'm talking about. But what do you think about these soldiers?
Sometimes they show what's going on.
Yeah, but what do you think about this? Like, because whatever they do to expose the crimes of Israeli state and doesn't change the outcome. It still happens. And when a soldier goes out there, like some of them, people who fought in the wars of 48, 67 and in between wars, and they exposed the crimes and they said, we are sorry, we are guilty, we are this and that. Like,
I mean,
how do you think it's valuable?
colonization marches on like a train, choo-choo train, keeps going. As colonization marches on, you never know the impact of what you do. And in other situations, in other countries, we know that it did make a difference because there's then declassified documents that show that activism and resistance do make a difference. For example, in the civil rights movement, when the President of the United States or the war against Vietnam, there were massive demonstrations and people were beaten. FBI arrested a lot of people and put people like Martin Luther King on the FBI list, etc. At the time, the politicians said, we continue, we don't care. That's what they said publicly. But privately, after you declassified the documents, you showed that how it influenced behavior and eventually got the U.S. out of Vietnam. The U.S. got out of Vietnam not because of a military defeat from the Vietnamese, because they were just finally tired of anti-war demonstrations in the U.S. and together with the resistance, of course, locally. So, but what I'm saying is, you never know the impact of what you do at the time you do it. And sometimes you will never know because you die before actual liberation. But you continue and you hope that it's making a difference. Now, I do want to mention that the Western media, which sometimes shows the brutality of the Israeli soldiers and settlers, they always presented as isolated incidents and not as part of a systematic policy of violence and terrorism that colonizers do. And sometimes other incidents may have even a more powerful impact at showing that there is a policy in place that is, a policy in place that could be problematic. I give you a very simple example from this town, Bethlehem. In 1967, when Israel occupied the West Bank, They wanted to deprive Palestinians of sources of self-sustenance. So they prevented them even from collecting rainwater. They prevented us even from owning milking cows. So the people of Bethlehem, this village, one time decided to have a civil disobedience and disobey. This is 1988. Disobey. And they went and actually bought some cows from an Israeli kibbutz farmer. 17 cows. One of them was pregnant, so they became 18 cows when they arrived and were being used here to produce milk for the children of Beit Sahur. The Israeli military discovered these cows and came here and told, was my cousin Jalal, who was the ringleader for the cow rebellion, as we called it. And they told him, you've got to kill these cows within 24 hours or get rid of them or sell them because you're not allowed to have cows. So of course, there was some discussion and they finally said, okay, 48 hours. So after 48 hours, I came back to the same place and asked the people, where are the cows? What did you do with the cows? And people said, what cows? We don't know anything about cows. So then the Israeli military started a military operation. And they have to name their operations. So they called it Operation Hunt Cow. Literally, it's almost unbelievable, okay? Operation Hunt Cow. They started looking for these cows. And people were, of course, during the 48 hours, have come up with the plans to smuggle the cows, hide them, move them around. Sometimes behind houses, between trees, in the caves, in the
so they were able to hide it.
Yeah. So there were the cows on the run, basically, and the Israeli military, even with helicopters, trying to find the cows.
What the
There
hell?
was even as part of a system of protecting the cows from the local people. There was a group of young people whose job was to go on the roofs of the houses at the edges of the town and have shifts and check where the military is coming from. If the military is coming from the south, for example, then the cows are moved to the north. If the military is coming from the east, the cows are moved to this west and so on. There was another group of young people whose unenviable task was to go behind the cows and make sure there's no traces, if you know what I mean. There's no shit of the cows on the streets and things like that. So this went on for months, and the Israeli military really became the butt of jokes around the West Bank for this, and it reached the Western media and the Israeli media. Now a story like this, makes people think, if it was just a military occupation, Germany occupied France, they didn't tell them you can't have cows, produce cheese and milk. No, they actually encouraged that. They loved French cheese because military occupation. But in military occupation, this story wouldn't make sense. But in colonization, it's absolutely logical. It makes full sense. Same reason as European colonizers, when they colonized North America, they killed 2 million buffaloes. Why did they kill 2 million buffaloes? For security reasons?
No.
This is to deprive the natives of their food, basically. This is natural. Natural not in the sense of excusing it or anything, it's in the sense of understanding it in the context which it is of colonization. So that's what I say, that they try to hide this system, they try to hide under this rubric of fighting terrorism and security and anti-Semitism and all sorts of excuses. But ultimately the truth of what it is not too difficult to discern if anybody looks, if anybody comes and sees. for themselves, then they can see what's going on.
My last question is, do you see agriculture as a form of resistance against colonialism? Because there are still a lot of people who are involved in agriculture despite the challenges. At least the ones that I interviewed, they've been facing a lot of challenges, but they're like, we're going to keep doing what we're doing. So do you think agricultural work is a form of resistance?
Yes, but I think it's actually larger than this issue. In what sense do I mean it's larger than the issue? Of course, as I said, the colonizers don't want you to have food sovereignty. And you try to have food sovereignty by cultivating your land, you are engaged in resistance by the nature of it. That is expected. But I say there's a deeper and more interesting meaning for your research to think about, which is that the colonizers also want to disconnect people from the land. And reconnecting people to the land, even if symbolically, even on 1 square meter that you cultivate a few seeds and you grow them, psychologically this is important for the people. So it's not just doing it in resistance to, if you want. It's doing it for your own sake of mental, physical well-being, and reconnecting to the land, which is what you are. Palestinians are the Canaanites, and we go back to the Fertile Crescent, the Natufian agriculture. That's the first human agriculture. First evidence of domesticated wheat is in a cave near here in the West Bank. We're going there to Tul Karam, actually. We can see it Tuesday. So this is who we are. This is who people are. This is who, when you see a farmer, everything in our culture is related to this agriculture. And reconnecting to the land is for our own sake, not just because it's resistance. Even our language, Arabic language, Palestinian language is very different than the language, let's say, of people in Saudi Arabia. People in Saudi Arabia, you don't hear, they wouldn't understand if you tell them hakura, for example. Hakura is Aramaic for a small land, farmland. Kurma, which is a piece of wood that's at the root of the tree, that's Aramaic. These are all approximately 20% of the, Ammiya, not the Fusha Arabic, the Ammiya of the Palestinians is related to agriculture and related to food and things like that people use, because that's because of their history. That's who they are. That's who we are. So you cannot just say it's because of resistance that they do agriculture. It's because of who they are that they do agriculture, which as a sideline ends up as a form of resistance. But they're not going out saying, I want to do agriculture because I want to resist the Israelis. That's not, the point of it, or the main point of it.
Yeah.
Sideline, of course, it does form a resistance.